finally caved and divided my wrap-ups because I just couldn't keep editing hour-long footage. I just couldn't. Hello everybody, my name is Roxy, this is Chaotic Bibliophile, and today I bring you the first part of my April wrap-up. Here's the thing, I love talking about books extensively. I try to be succinct and not repeat myself too much. I do it, but I also cut out a lot. At the same time, as I mentioned in a past video, when I started taking my time with each book, I also got a really good response. So I'm trying to find that balance. And that has meant really long videos. Not so long to watch. I feel like for wrap-ups, 30-40 minutes, it's actually quite nice. But editing that, in my case, means having edited it down from an hour and 20 or so. And I just couldn't go on like that. So I made a poll on my Bookstagram, link down below. And what won was actually doing a mid-month wrap-up and at the end of the month wrap-up. That was the original intention, not gonna lie. I just didn't find the time and there were always videos to put out. So this is part one. Next week I have a different video in stock for you and then we'll do part two. I didn't order these in any way. I should. I have now ordered them from least enjoyed to most enjoyed. I don't have any book that I DNF'd or that I really hated. However, I didn't do this in the order that I read them, so I didn't take, for example, only the first books that I finished in the first half. I just looked at the pile of books that I had finished and selected a few that I had more to say about and then some others that I didn't. Otherwise, I felt it would be too unbalanced. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but it makes sense in my head. So without further ado, let's get into the books. First, there is a book that I actually forgot to tell you about in March. And the reason I forgot to tell you in March is because in March I had a 2-day vacation. My mom and I went to like a 5-star hotel because they were having a sale, which was totally the way to go considering right after that the city went into like very severe lockdown and I finished that book there. But I have not fully unpacked the books that I brought and I also bought a couple books during that vacation. Yeah, it's hilarious. I think it says a lot about who I am as a person, the fact that I hadn't unpacked. It was only because I wanted to write a review for a site in Spanish that I remembered that book and I began thinking back to my March wrap-up and I realized I hadn't talked about it. It was so odd and I was like, oh, such a mess sometimes. But anyways, it's here and it's an Argentinian book that sadly it's not translated into English just yet. I don't know that it will. It's very slice of life. And I find that the US and English-speaking countries aren't very interested in Latin American slice of life. But if you speak Spanish and read in Spanish, I really recommend this. I'll tell you in a second what it is. It's Los Años Tristes de Kawabata by Miguel Sardegna or Sardegna. Translates to Kawabata's Sad Years. It's a really slim but wonderful novel of the kind that you know I adore. It's about this professor of Japanese literature at the Universidad de Buenos Aires, so the main university in Buenos Aires, and he is reflecting upon grief in general, but it's twofold because his father just passed away and he had been estranged from him for a long time, so he's processing this grief. But at the same time, he's also thinking about his mom, who was Japanese, so he is of Japanese descent. His mom committed suicide when the protagonist was very young, and so of course it had a deep impact on him. Specifically, what transpires in the book is that at the beginning, the narrator and protagonist finds out his father has passed away and is assigned to write a sort of biography on Kawabata, and so he travels to Kyoto. It's so nice. It's one of those books that it's really bittersweet but hugs your heart at the same time. It's really well written. The prose is very clean. It doesn't go into too much sentimentality, but isn't afraid to touch those tender spots, but it's also not a soft fest. It also has like a really nice appreciation for Japanese literature, and in turn is very Japanese infused. It has a lot of attention to detail, and of course it has a lot of intertextuality and analyzes a lot of Kawabata's literature, which of course prompted me to get a Kawabata book. I haven't read it yet, I really want to. If you saw last week's vlog, you'll know that I was about to get another Kawabata book, but I refrained, and I'm going to read the one that I own first. But yeah, it's just a really nice book. If you read in Spanish, I really recommend it. By the way, maybe you don't care about these things, but I really do. I love the feel of this book in my hand. It's a bit wider than your normal average book, and the pages are very nice. It has really cool spacing, so you can underline, and it also has white margins. That's the receipt. That's always important for me because it lets you take notes and interact with the book. So I hope you don't mind that I also comment on the physical properties of the books. It's something I'm very passionate about. Anyways, let's move on to the books that I did read in April. I think all of these are either in English or translated. This is the Spanish edition of Kim JiYoung, born 1982, by Cho NamJoo. This is translated by Joo HaSun. I'm very happy that the person who translated is Korean. I'll of course credit the English language translator down below. I always do. So this, I have thoughts and feelings. So here's the thing. This is a very important book. I'm so happy that it's being published. It was a book that South Korea needed, and it's been a bestseller there, and it's so important that it was a bestseller there. So I'm glad this book exists. It's a very important capital I book. This is about a woman, Kim JiYoung, who is like any other woman in South Korea. It uses her as an individual, as an example of all the terrible, horrible sexist things that women go through in Korea. In case you haven't been following that, South Korea has been seeing a wonderfully impetuous movement of feminism. It's amazing. It's angering because it's something that they need to fight for, but at the same time it's so heartening to see the strength of those women. However, I didn't like the writing style. It's very matter of fact. It's not badly written. It's well organized. It's not like this doesn't make any sense, but there's also no art to it. The aesthetic choice is a very dry police report almost. It also has footnotes because it cites the statistics, which people have commented that they feel they are unnecessary, and the author has defended them by saying she feels like people wouldn't believe these things happen unless she had the notes. In my case, I believe it, but I wasn't bothered by the notes. It's just citations. It's not a big deal, you know. Also, it's not incorporated into the narrative. It's not a people in the tree situation where it's part of the conceit. It's just citations of the facts. I think it's useful if you want to know more, but it doesn't really affect my reading of the book in any way. What does affect the reading of the book is the ending, because the ending sees a shift or a clarification in narration that makes the aesthetic choice of the beginning make sense. I'm sorry I'm being cryptic, I just don't want to spoil it for you. And it made me go, I see it. Plus, I thought the ending itself, the last 5 pages, were absolutely brilliant. Not only what happens, but the way it's written. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, because here's the thing. If this wasn't so short, if I wasn't so sure this book was so important, and if I didn't need to read it to review it for the podcast in Spanish, would I have finished this? I don't know, because I really wasn't enjoying it. Again, I felt for Kim JiYoung because she's a woman and I understand. And it's true what happens to her, but for me, the writing is important. And here 2 questions arise. 1, if I think the aesthetic choice is justified, but I still don't appreciate the aesthetic choice aesthetically, if I think it's not a good literary achievement, is it excused because it fulfills the intended purpose of the author? That's the first question. And the second is, do I erase my sort of struggling with the book for the majority of it, because it makes sense at the end, because you realize that the aesthetic choice was so justified, and because the end was really good. Not surprising in the plot twisty sense, but like she went there sort of surprising. I don't have an answer to these questions, therefore I'm very happy I don't give out star ratings anymore. I also think this is a strength of the book, that because it's so undemanding aesthetically, it's very flat and bare bones. I think it's very good for a lot of readers, and it's translated, which is always a plus in my opinion. It's from another culture and they want to explore. I think this is very accessible in that way without softening the edges. So a lot of conflicting thoughts on this book. I know I've been talking about 10 minutes about one single book, but I really needed to discuss these thoughts. By the way, if that's not enough for you, I also wrote a little piece. It's not very long. It's on my website, linked down below, which I still haven't officially introduced. I will get to that at some point, but you can still check it out in the meantime. And I wrote about that and about 2 different aspects of the book. So please give it a read if you're interested. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Would I recommend it? Not super broadly, and definitely not as a literary achievement, but under certain circumstances. I actually think it would be better read at a social studies class than a literature class, for example. Make of that what you will. Okay, moving on to something I don't have that much to say about, and that is Shelf Life, Writers on Books and Reading, edited by Alex Johnson. I got this book last year, I think, in a Canadian bookstore, and I picked it up, I think because it had essays by Walter Benjamin and Arthur Schopenhauer, and I thought that was very interesting that these were sort of historical, not writers writing today, because although I am also very interested in that, I feel like there is no shortage of that. This is very old-timey. I didn't notice until I started reading it that all the authors in here are men. So what's up with that, Alex? This was put out by the British Library. It's very, almost like a toy book. It's not hardback exactly, and it's not paperback either. I don't know how to describe this sort of cover. This was very hit or miss for me. There were some essays that I thought were very blah, and there were some others that I really appreciated, like the Schopenhauer one, like the Benjamin one. But my favorite actually was On Destroying Books by J.C. Squire, who was a magazine editor, poet, and journalist. That one was the best one. If you're going to read one essay from this book, look that up because it's brilliant. Other than that, I wouldn't especially recommend this unless you're interested in essays that are a bit older. It, again, feels very old-timey. It feels like something Theodore Roosevelt would read. Do you know what I mean? And actually, I think there is a Theodore Roosevelt essay here. It's interesting because I feel like a lot of perceptions have changed. There are a lot of perceptions in here about good literature and can certain types of literature rot your brain, and I think that discussion is still very relevant, not only in relation to literature but all media. So I enjoyed it. I'm going to keep it, but I didn't absolutely love it. Then I have 2 poetry, let's call them collections, but it's actually like 2 Penguin Classics booklets. The first one is The Nightingales Are Drunk by, I want to say Hafez. It feels like it should be an A. It's one of the greatest Persian poets. He lived in the 14th century, I want to say. He has a very funny story. There is a different book that I'm going to talk about on my second wrap-up. They talked about the history of this poet, and it's quite amusing. Apparently, these verses revealed to him after having fasted for many days. He thought they were inspired by God and dictated for him by God. I enjoyed them. They are very old-timey in the sense that they use a lot of calling attention to the poet sort of resources, like he talks about himself in third person. That might be related to the God thing, but They were very nice. They were very sensuous. I like that. They talk a lot about the pleasures of the flesh, and not only sex, but also food and wine. So yeah, if you want some very sensory poetry, I do recommend this. I think this is also like a really good taster edition, and it's of course very cheap, so you can't go wrong. I also read Lips Too Chilled collection of haikus by Matsuo Basho. I love Basho. I really enjoy his haikus and his illustrations. I enjoyed this. It was like nice to sit down one night and get to them, but it's just the haikus. If you really don't know anything about haikus and you don't really know if you're going to like them and you don't want to invest in a better edition, then that's okay, you can read these. But if you're really interested in starting out, I would just recommend you get a good anthology that also has some nice approachable critical commentary. I don't have any suggestions, especially not in English, but I think you'd be better off that way. In case you don't know, haikus are these 3-line poems. They have the syllable scheme that here, yeah, they don't respect the syllable scheme, the 757, right? But I still enjoyed the imagery because I like Basho and I like his poetic project. So I enjoyed it. Would I recommend this edition in particular? No, but if you're interested in haiku, you definitely need to read Basho because he is one of the greats. Then I read a really slim book. I feel like this looks slim, but it's really information packed. What Happened to Art Criticism by James Elkins. Let me just show you. It doesn't have big margins at all. I thought this was going to be more art criticism in daily life and art enjoyment, but it's actually a very, not academic necessarily, but it's like very field-oriented book, if you know what I mean. It's for critics. I'm very interested in criticism, so I did appreciate it, but I wouldn't recommend it if you are interested in art criticism insofar as you getting to the art. This is reflecting about criticism itself. It's a very rigorous exploration. I don't know that I agree with all of the author's conclusions, but I did enjoy the exploration. He proposes there are, I think, 7 types of main criticism, and he talks about the different styles, their strengths, their flaws. Again, very interesting, very dense. You do need to be very awake to get through this. What I like the most is that it made me want to return to theory, because of course during my undergrad program I was very much into it and I read a lot of it, and because of that precisely I stopped once I graduated. But I think I want to go back to it. Also because by the end of my program I was doing, as I said, literary linguistics, and that doesn't use a lot of literary theory. It uses more linguistic theory and stylistic theory, but it's not quite the same thing. And so this really makes me want to go back to hard, dense academic literary criticism. So yeah, it's one of those books that just makes you think, you know? I would really definitely recommend it if you're interested in the discipline of art criticism. I think you can extrapolate a lot of the ideas present in that book to all types of art. Another book that also made me want to dive right back into theory was The Possessed by Elif Batuman. I finally got to this book. A lot of people told me they had this book and they were curious about my thoughts on it. I was like, yes, I'm going to get to it. Well, I finally did. I'm so excited. I have many thoughts on this book. Let me read you the subtitle though. Adventures with Russian Books and the People Who Read Them. I love the whole packaging of this because I feel it speaks to the heart of the book. I don't know if you can see that clearly, but it has these vignettes of people like being so engrossed by books. And then the back is also very humorous. Let me read you the blurb. If you're going to read just one book about conference planning, Isaac Babel, Leo Tolstoy, Boys' Legs contests, giant apes, Uzbek poetry, the life of the mind, and resignation of the soul, seek no further. This is the book for you. You see, there is this idea of ridiculousness and grandeur, but folk grandeur, and I just found that so good. Now, is this book absolutely the best book I've read in my entire life? No, it's not. It's also a book that I think you'll only enjoy if you're very interested in the academic world. But not in the way that maybe you are looking for an academic book. This is not that. The tone is also not that. It sort of looks at the absurdity that is the academic world. Having to make a living and having to find a job and finding, we all gotta eat, versus you also just do it because you love it, especially in the humanities, in this very utilitarian world that we're living. It's even more absurd. I like that she mixes that up, mixes her own personal experiences with her theory of the novel. She talks about doing linguistics first, and then how linguistics had sort of disappointed her in what it could tell her about the world, and she discovered that literary studies really did that for her, made her feel that she was analyzing the true human condition, and so that's why she's stuck, especially with novels and with big novels. She here proposes a new approach almost, and I wrote that here because I was so interested in it. Proposes looking and loving literature through its history, through its form, through dissection. I will say that the slowest parts were when she went too much into the scenes. It made me reach this conclusion. I don't want to read The Idiot. I think I might, only because it's a campus novel and I want to have read as many campus novels as I want, or at least try to. If I DNF it, then I DNF it. But it doesn't make me want to read it. I don't really feel like I will enjoy that book. However, I do feel like I want to read everything she's written in an academic capacity, because when she gets to her theories, very conversationally, I might add, that is something that if you've ever seen an interview with Elif Batuman, it's like her speaking. Her mind really works this way. I'm in love with this book, but I don't think it's necessarily good objectively. And as a memoir, it doesn't really have a narrative arc. It's very like this. It's so fun and I loved it. So if you are like me, you might enjoy it. But bear in mind all the things I said, because I wasn't kidding. It's very much that and no more, but I loved it. Another book I enjoyed, but I do think everyone should read, is The Joy Luck Club by Jamie Chang. I read this as part of the Gilmore Girls challenge. I am still doing that. I just haven't read 3 books to tell you about yet, but I will do it. And I will do a wrap up with those 3 books and analyzing the relationships to the characters and whether they make sense. That hasn't died. It's there in the back of my mind. I just haven't gotten to it just yet, but it's coming. It's coming. Anyways, this is a novel, but it's also a collection of short stories. It's interconnected short stories. I think that is the best way of describing it. But as Jamie Chang has actually said, people called it a novel because back then they didn't have this market idea of interconnected short stories. It's about 4 daughters. The mothers are all Chinese, born and raised, and they went to the United States because of different circumstances, but mainly because they didn't have any other choice. They needed to escape China, and they had this idea of the Joy Luck Club where they met to play mahjong but also invest together. So there are these really interesting ideas of community there. And it's also about the daughters. It starts with one daughter that you think is going to be the protagonist, and in a way she is, but there are sections where she's entirely absent because, as I said, it's short story. It's a bit like Olive again in that way. And well, the 4 daughters are American, born and raised. But of course, they have this whole Chinese heritage. And that is, of course, a terrible source of tension and strain between the girls and their mothers. It's just so good. It's so well written. It's so unapologetically Chinese, and I'm actually a bit surprised that more people aren't picking this up right now, because I think it's such solid writing. It's so beautiful but heartbreaking, and some of the things that happen are terrible, but it also includes moments of great clarity, and the relationships between the mothers and the daughters are so nuanced. The daughters grew up together but then didn't really become friends. They are like family, they are like cousins, right? Not actually, but effectively, yes. Their relationship amongst each other is very interesting as well. It's so good. I really want to reread it. I think it's amazing. It's really, really solid literature. It's not only the themes, it's also the writing. Good all around. Really, really recommend you pick this up. And finally, I finished The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century by Alex Ross. If you've been following me, at least from December last year. You know who Alex Ross is because I love listening to this so much, and he did it again with this book. I adored it so much. I do have a lot of things to say about it though. I also will say before we get into this book that I am considering buying his 2020 book that is about Wagner and politics. I'm not that interested. I don't like Wagner that much. I'm sorry. I will consider listening to more of his music. I'm going to watch the Ring Cycle in full eventually, but it's just not my thing. I also understand why he's so fascinating. He created things of such beauty, but he was also so fucking evil. I know all of that, but I'm not interested in reading a whole book of it. Unless it's written by Alex Ross, because he's so good and I'm undecided. Anyways, what is this? This also, by the way, includes, of course, a section on Wagner and politics. Basically, it's the story of the turn of the century, the past century, so from the 19th to the 20th. It starts there and it goes through classical music up to the 2000s, so from century to century, basically. And it provides analysis that includes the cultural, but also the musical and the artistic. It goes into quite a bit of the music theory aspect of it, and it explains some of it. So it explains, for example, what is 12th tone theory and method, but it also does some music analysis. So I don't think you won't get anything out of this book if you don't know any music theory, but you do need to be prepared to either just ignore that part or look up stuff. I know very little music theory, and I thought it was enough for me to understand his main ideas. It was just really good. It's a history book, organized a bit confusingly, I think, if you don't know anything about classical music. It is chronological in a way, but it's also thematic. So for example, the first section is the Golden Age, Strauss, Mahler, and the fin de siècle. And then the second section is Dr. Faust, Schoenberg, Debussy, and Atonality, Dance of the Earth, which talks about Stravinsky. And then it goes into Invisible Man, which talks about American classical music. But it's not like Schoenberg won't pop up later on, and atonality won't remain a very important element, if you see what I mean. So it goes a bit back and forth. Because it is such like an important book in the classical music world, it is sold as a great place to start, and I don't think this is it. I think it is one of the best books I've ever read on classical music, yes, but I don't think it's a good place to start. I think you need to know the names, definitely. I would actually suggest you start with The Lives of the Composers, this book here that I read and loved last year. I talked about it in all my music books ranked down below. That is a really good way to start, and then go to this if you like the theory, because that book talks about the composers themselves and a little bit about their aesthetic, and it's again chronologically organized. It's a broad and general, superficial, if you will, look at it, but it's an excellent primer. It's actually the best primer you can have if you know nothing. That way you will know enough to dip into this and enjoy it to its full extent. I will, of course, definitely reread it. I marked it all over, of course. It talks about history, but also ideas and music aesthetics. It's just so good. But compared to Listen to This, of course, Listen to This has a much broader appeal. It talks about different kinds of music. It also is meant for the general audiences. I think this is meant for general audiences who already like classical music, whereas Listen to This has the potential of getting you into classical music. So two very different books, but my main point still stands. Alex Ross is great, and I want to read everything he's ever written, including possibly, maybe, perhaps his Wagner book. Those are the books I wanted to tell you about. I'm very happy I did this separation, because even though I talked about less books on this occasion, I've been filming for almost 15 minutes. It's time to go. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up, please subscribe, share this video, and comment. Have you read any of these books? Do you want to read any of these books after hearing me talk about them? If you've read anything interesting or have any suggestions because of something I said in this video, please do let me know. Don't forget to check out my Bookstagram, my book Twitter. Everything is linked down below. That's it. See you next time. Also, be sure to tune in next week, because I'm so excited for that video that's coming up. We're discussing her main focuses are